The day I discovered the truth, everything in my life shifted. I had suspected something for months, a missed call here, a message she quickly deleted there. My wife, Andrea, had been growing distant, her laughter with me replaced by excuses and late nights. I tried to convince myself it was stress, that maybe I wasn't doing enough to make her happy. But the evidence mounted. A forgotten email open on her laptop revealed dinner reservations I didn't know about. Whispers of her meeting with her ex, the father of my stepdaughter, began to feel like more than just coincidence. Still, I held on to hope, believing this was just paranoia, or worse, insecurity. Then came the argument. It started over something trivial, but the tension between us snapped like an overstretched cord. "You're always watching me," she yelled, her face flushed with anger. I wanted to yell back, to demand answers, but I walked away, desperate for air. Hours later, I returned home, expecting the silence of an empty house. Instead, I was met with hushed voices and laughter coming from our bedroom. My heart sank. I knew before I opened the door what I would find, but nothing could prepare me for the sight of Andrea and him tangled in my sheets. She didn't even try to deny it. "You weren't supposed to be home," she said flatly, as though I was the one in the wrong. Her lover, Nate, had the audacity to look smug, as though this was his rightful place in my home. My stepdaughter's father, sitting where I should have been, acting as if he owned my life. I stood frozen, the betrayal washing over me in waves. Words failed me. My chest felt like it was caving in. "You should leave," Andrea said, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. I couldn't process it. My wife, the woman I had built a life with, had not only betrayed me but had the gall to act like I was intruding. I turned and walked out, the door slamming behind me. Each step away from that house felt heavier than the last. Driving aimlessly, I replayed everything in my mind. The good times, the love I thought we shared. Had it all been a lie? The weight of her actions was suffocating. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted the pain to stop. I parked at the edge of a quiet park, staring into the night. I wasn't ready to process what I'd seen, but one thing was clear. The marriage I thought I had was over. The truth wasn't just that Andrea had cheated. It was who she had cheated with, the layers of betrayal that cut deeper than I thought possible. My stepdaughter's father wasn't just a man from her past. He was someone we had both sworn to keep at a distance for the sake of our family. Now, it was clear that she had brought him into the center of my world, betraying every promise we had made. I sat there, numb, as the reality of the situation settled in. I was no longer her husband in anything but name. The morning after I caught Andrea and Nate together, I woke up on my brother's couch. Sleep had been elusive, my thoughts a swirling storm of betrayal, anger, and confusion. The memory of them together played on a loop in my head, taunting me. The man I had tolerated for the sake of my stepdaughter, her ex, Nate, had stepped into my life and ripped apart what little stability I had left. I spent most of that morning in a fog, unable to bring myself to face the day. My brother tried to cheer me up, offering coffee and lame jokes, but I could barely muster a response. The phone on the table vibrated repeatedly with Andrea's name flashing across the screen, but I didn't have the strength to answer. By midday, I finally gathered the courage to head back to the house. My home, the place I had poured years of hard work into. As I opened the door, the air felt heavier, the walls echoing with an unfamiliar silence. I half expected Andrea to greet me with some flimsy excuse, but instead, I found her in the living room, seated on the edge of the couch with a cold, detached expression. "We need to talk," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. I stared at her, waiting for her to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, some semblance of remorse. Instead, she leaned back and crossed her arms. "Let's not drag this out," she began, her voice calm and calculated. "Yes, I've been seeing Nate. I love him." The words hit me like a freight train. I staggered back, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. "You love him?" I echoed, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Yes," she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's been going on for a while. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending. My mind struggled to process her words. She didn't mean for it to happen? She was tired of pretending? Her lack of remorse was staggering. What about us? What about our family? I demanded, my voice rising. Andrea rolled her eyes, as if my reaction was inconveniencing her. Adrian, let's not make this bigger than it is. We both know this marriage hasn't been working for a long time. Her words were like daggers, each one twisting deeper than the last. I had fought for our marriage, sacrificed so much to make her happy, and now she was acting as though it had all been meaningless. As the argument escalated, my stepdaughter, Sophie, walked into the room. She looked between us, her expression a mix of confusion and guilt. "What's going on?" she asked hesitantly. Andrea turned to her daughter with a smile that made my stomach churn. "We're just having an honest conversation, sweetie," she said. An honest conversation? I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. This wasn't honesty. It was betrayal wrapped in apathy. I tried to appeal to Sophie, hoping she would see the hurt in my eyes and understand the gravity of what was happening. But the look she gave me sent a chill down my spine. It was a look of pity, not loyalty. "We're a family, Sophie," I said, my voice breaking. "I've always tried to do what's best for us." Sophie hesitated, glancing at her mother before replying, "I know, Adrian, but maybe this is for the best." The words crushed me. Even my stepdaughter, the girl I had raised and loved like my own, had chosen her mother's side. Andrea stood, her expression smug. "You can stay here for now," she said casually, "but I think it's clear we need to separate. I've already spoken to a lawyer." The room spun. She had planned this, every step, every move. She had orchestrated this betrayal with precision, ensuring I was blindsided and powerless. I stared at her, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. But instead of lashing out, I turned and walked away. I needed to leave before I said something I couldn't take back. That night, I sat in my car, parked in an empty lot, and stared at the stars. The weight of the day pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. My family had chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. The woman I had loved, the stepdaughter I had cherished, they had both betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. As I sat there, I made a silent vow. If they wanted to tear me down, I wouldn't make it easy for them. I would rise from this, stronger and more determined than ever. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The day the divorce papers arrived, I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. It was heavy in my hands, both physically and emotionally. I knew this moment was inevitable, but seeing it laid out in stark black and white made it real. Andrea hadn't wasted any time. She was meticulous in her demands, claiming the house, my car, a significant portion of my savings, and even alimony. Her audacity was staggering. She had betrayed me, humiliated me, and now she wanted to strip me of everything I'd worked for. My lawyer, a sharp and seasoned man named David, sat across from me as we reviewed the document. "She's playing hardball," he said, flipping through the pages. "This is a classic case of leveraging false narratives to gain sympathy." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of false narratives?" David sighed and slid the papers toward me, pointing to a section. "She's claiming you were controlling and emotionally abusive." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Andrea's betrayal was one thing, but this felt like a calculated attack on my character. I had spent years supporting her dreams, putting her happiness above my own, and now she was rewriting history to paint me as the villain. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle began in earnest. Andrea played her role perfectly, presenting herself as the wronged wife to anyone who would listen. She spread rumors among mutual friends, claiming I had made her life unbearable. To my dismay, even some of my family members began to believe her. "She just seems so broken," my brother, Michael, said during a tense phone call. "Maybe you should let her have the house. It might help smooth things over." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Smooth things over? She's the one who cheated, Michael. She's the one who's trying to take everything from me. He hesitated. "I just think it's better to avoid a fight." I hung up, realizing that even my family was siding with Andrea. The isolation was suffocating. As the weeks dragged on, Andrea's demands only grew. She began pushing for full control of the house, claiming she needed it to provide stability for Sophie. I had no issue with Sophie having a home, but the hypocrisy of her argument was infuriating. She had no problem tearing our family apart for Nate. Yet now she wanted to pretend she cared about stability? I refused to back down. With David's guidance, I began gathering evidence to counter her claims. Old messages, financial records, even testimonies from colleagues who could vouch for my character. I compiled everything. The day we finally faced each other in mediation, Andrea walked in with the same cold confidence she'd had the night I caught her with Nate. She sat across from me, flanked by her lawyer, and barely spared me a glance. Her lawyer opened with a speech about how Andrea had endured years of emotional neglect and needed the divorce settlement to rebuild her life. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting back the urge to yell. When it was my turn to speak, I remained calm. I laid out my evidence, detailing the sacrifices I had made for our family, the betrayal I had endured, and the toll it had taken on me. Andrea's mask began to crack. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly unprepared for my level of preparation. As I spoke, I felt a surge of strength. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity. By the end of the session, the mediator had a clearer picture of the situation. Andrea's claims were not as airtight as she had hoped, and her demands were deemed excessive. The ruling wasn't perfect, but it was fair. I retained my savings and a portion of the house's equity. Andrea would keep the house, but her alimony request was denied, and she would be responsible for covering her legal fees. When the session ended, Andrea approached me in the hallway. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but instead, she simply said, "You'll regret this." I met her gaze, unflinching. "No, Andrea. I think I've finally made the right decision." Walking out of that building, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The divorce was far from the clean break I had hoped for, but it was a step toward freedom. For the first time in months, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. As I drove home, I made a silent promise to myself. I would rebuild. I would rise above this, and I would never let anyone take advantage of me again. After the divorce was finalized, I moved into a small, two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A space where I could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of Andrea's betrayal and manipulation. The house we'd once shared was a memory I didn't want to revisit. The silence in the apartment was jarring at first. The absence of Sophie's laughter or Andrea's constant berating left an eerie void. For years, my life had been centered around my family, even when they didn't treat me like one. Now, I was left to figure out who I was without them. My days felt like an endless loop. I'd wake up, stare at the ceiling for far too long, and force myself to go to work. The job was my only lifeline, routine I clung to when everything else had fallen apart. But even there, the whispers of coworkers who knew about the divorce followed me. "Hey, Adrian," a colleague said one afternoon, his tone cautious. "How are you holding up?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just taking it one day at a time." He nodded awkwardly, sensing the walls I'd built around myself. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I felt like a ghost, drifting through the motions of life without really living it. Weekends were the hardest. Without work to occupy my mind, I was left alone with my thoughts. Andrea's betrayal played on a loop in my head, her coldness, her disdain, her audacity. I replayed arguments, moments of humiliation, and the times I had tried to save a marriage that was already doomed. One Saturday, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at a half-eaten sandwich and unopened mail. The sunlight streaming through the window felt intrusive, mocking me for my inability to move on. That's when my phone buzzed. It was my brother, Michael. "You've got to stop hiding," he said bluntly. "Come out for dinner tonight. Let's talk." I wanted to refuse, to retreat further into my cocoon, but something about his tone struck a chord. Maybe I needed to hear what he had to say, even if I didn't want to admit it. That evening, I met Michael at a small diner we used to frequent as kids. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're letting her win, Adrian," he said, leaning across the table. "You're stuck, and she's probably out there living her best life while you're wallowing." His words stung, but they were true. Andrea had taken so much from me. My dignity, my confidence, my sense of self. And here I was, letting her take even more by staying stuck in the past. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. Pretend like none of this happened? Act like I'm okay? No, Michael said firmly. But you can start rebuilding. Take small steps. Focus on yourself for once. That night, I went home and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. Tired eyes, slumped shoulders, a face that had forgotten how to smile. Michael was right. I couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, I made a list of small goals. Start exercising. Cook real meals. Reconnect with old friends. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step was the hardest. I dragged myself to the gym, feeling out of place among the toned bodies and determined faces. But as I started running on the treadmill, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. With each step, I felt like I was shedding a piece of the weight I'd been carrying. Cooking was another challenge. My culinary skills were rusty at best, but there was something therapeutic about chopping vegetables and experimenting with recipes. The kitchen became my sanctuary, a place where I could create something tangible and nourishing. Slowly, life began to feel less like a punishment. I started reconnecting with old friends, people who had been there before Andrea consumed my world. They welcomed me back without judgment, their laughter and support reminding me that I wasn't alone. Work became more than just a routine. I threw myself into projects, volunteering for assignments that challenged me. My boss noticed, and for the first time in years, I felt like my efforts were being recognized. By the end of those first few months, the apartment no longer felt like a lonely exile. It was becoming a home, a reflection of the man I was starting to rebuild. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights twinkle, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Andrea may have broken me, but she didn't destroy me. Piece by piece, I was putting myself back together, stronger than before. Rebuilding my life after Andrea felt like scaling a mountain without a guide, but each step upward was a reminder that I was moving forward. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but the determination to reclaim my sense of self was stronger. It started with a commitment to my health. I made a habit of hitting the gym every morning before work. At first, it was grueling. My muscles protested, and I felt out of place among the regulars. But with time, it became a refuge. The weights I lifted weren't just physical. They were symbolic of the burdens I was shedding. The steady rhythm of my workouts brought clarity and focus. One day, as I was finishing a session, the gym trainer approached me. "You've been consistent," he said, nodding in approval. "You're making progress. Keep it up." Those words, simple as they were, felt like a win. I was finally seeing tangible results, not just in my body but in my mindset. Work became another pillar of my rebuild. I poured my energy into every task, volunteering for projects and staying late to perfect presentations. My boss, Mr. Carlisle, began to take notice. "You've been on fire lately," he said during a meeting. "We've got an opening for a project lead. Interested?" I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The promotion came with a better salary, a corner office, and the respect I had worked so hard to earn. It wasn't just a career boost. It was proof that I could thrive on my own. Socially, I started reconnecting with old friends, the ones Andrea had gradually pushed out of my life. Marcus, my closest friend from college, was one of the first people I reached out to. "Adrian, it's been ages," he said when we met for drinks. "What happened, man? You just vanished." I told him everything. The betrayal, the divorce, the struggles of starting over. He listened without judgment, offering the kind of support I hadn't realized I needed. "You're better off without her," Marcus said firmly. "This is your time to shine." As my confidence grew, I began exploring new interests. Photography, something I dabbled in years ago, became a passion. I spent weekends wandering the city, capturing moments of beauty and chaos through my lens. The photos became a visual diary of my journey, each one a reminder of how far I'd come. One Saturday, I attended a local photography exhibit. I found myself drawn to a series of portraits that told stories of resilience. The photographer, A woman named Natalie struck up a conversation with me when she saw me admiring her work. "You have a good eye," she said, smiling. "Are you a photographer?" "Amateur," I admitted. "Well, everyone starts somewhere. Keep shooting. You never know where it might take you." Her words stuck with me. Photography became more than a hobby. It was a way to process my emotions and channel my energy into something meaningful. There were moments when the past tried to creep back in. Andrea's voice echoed in my mind during quiet nights, her insults replaying like a broken record. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. Each day, I reclaimed a piece of myself that she had tried to take away. One evening, as I was reviewing a property deal for work, I received an email notification. It was from Sophie, my stepdaughter. "Adrian, I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about everything and wanted to say I'm sorry for how I acted. I see now that you didn't deserve any of it. I hope we can talk someday." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to reply immediately, to mend the bridge that had been burned. But another part of me hesitated. Sophie had chosen Andrea's side when it mattered most, and forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Despite the email, I chose to focus on the positives. The life I was building didn't depend on validation from Andrea or her circle. It was about me, my growth, my happiness, my peace. By the time 6 months had passed, I barely recognized the man I used to be. The tired, defeated version of myself had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more self-assured. One evening, as I stood on my balcony, camera in hand, capturing the golden hues of the setting sun, I realized something profound. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was rediscovering it. 6 months after the divorce, life began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving me with a clearer view of what mattered. My dedication at work was finally paying off, and the promotion to project lead had set the tone for a new chapter in my life. It started with an unexpected meeting. Mr. Carlyle, my boss, called me into his office. The man was a straight shooter, and his praise never came lightly. "Adrian," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I've been watching you these past few months. You've been consistent, innovative, and reliable. We have a new division opening up, and I want you to lead it." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "You want me to lead a division?" He nodded. "The role comes with a significant raise, additional benefits, and, of course, a lot of responsibility. I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think you could handle it." The weight of his words hit me. For years, I had poured myself into my work, often feeling like it went unnoticed. This wasn't just a promotion, it was validation. "I'm honored," I said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this opportunity." The new role came with its challenges. I had to oversee a team, manage larger accounts, and ensure the division's success. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I thrived under the pressure. The late nights and long hours were worth it, especially when I saw the results of our work. The first project under my leadership was a success, exceeding all expectations. Mr. Carlyle's feedback was glowing, and my team began to see me not just as their boss, but as someone they could rely on. With the promotion came a better salary, which allowed me to finally indulge in a few luxuries. I upgraded my apartment to a spacious loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Decorating the place became a project of its own. Each piece of furniture, every framed photograph, was a reflection of the man I was becoming. The loft wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of my growth. One evening, as I unpacked boxes in my new space, Marcus stopped by with a bottle of whiskey. "Cheers to the new place," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "Thanks," I replied, taking a sip. He leaned back on the couch, looking around. "You've come a long way, Adrian. I mean, look at this place. It's a far cry from where you were 6 months ago." I nodded, thinking back to the dark days right after the divorce. "It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but I had to make a choice. Let the past define me or take control of my future." Marcus raised his glass. "To taking control." The promotion and new apartment were just the beginning. My photography hobby began to take off as well. I started sharing my work online, and to my surprise, it gained traction. A local gallery reached out, expressing interest in showcasing my photos in an upcoming exhibit. The gallery event was a small affair, but it was meaningful. As I stood among my displayed photographs, watching strangers admire my work, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in years. The turning point came during a networking event for work. I met Claire, a marketing consultant who was as sharp as she was kind. We struck up a conversation, and what began as a casual chat turned into a deep, engaging discussion about life, resilience, and personal growth. By the end of the evening, I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time. Claire had a warmth about her that was refreshing, and when she suggested meeting for coffee, I didn't hesitate to say yes. As my career flourished and my personal life began to heal, I realized I was finally breaking free from the shadow Andrea had cast over me. The pain of her betrayal was still a scar, but it no longer defined me. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of balance. The promotion, the new home, the budding connection with Claire. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my loft, watching the city lights flicker, I couldn't help but smile. This was my life now, a life I had fought for, a life I was proud of. Just when life seemed to be settling into a rhythm, the past found a way to intrude. It began with a text message from my brother, Michael. "Hey, Adrian. It's been a while. Can we talk? It's important." At first, I considered ignoring it. The last time I'd heard from Michael, he was backing Andrea during the divorce, spouting nonsense about how I should be more understanding. That memory alone was enough to sour my mood. But curiosity got the better of me, and I replied with a curt, "What's this about?" His response came quickly, "Mom wants to see you. She's been asking for you a lot lately. Can we meet?" I agreed to meet him the following weekend, though my expectations were low. Michael suggested we meet at our mother's house, and when I arrived, I was greeted with the same air of judgment I remembered. Mom was sitting on the couch, her face etched with a mix of worry and guilt. Michael stood by the window, avoiding eye contact. "Adrian," Mom started, her voice soft. "It's good to see you. We've missed you." I raised an eyebrow. "Missed me? That's interesting, considering how quick you were to side with Andrea." Her face fell, and Michael winced, but I didn't feel guilty for pointing it out. I had spent months rebuilding my life while they played cheerleader for the woman who betrayed me. "Look, we made mistakes," Michael said, finally breaking the silence. "But things have been tough since the divorce. Andrea, well, she hasn't exactly been doing great." "Not my problem," I said bluntly. "That's the thing," Michael continued. "She's been calling Mom, asking for help, and, well, we thought maybe you could step in." I stared at him, trying to process what I just heard. "You want me to help Andrea? Are you serious?" "It's not just her," Mom interjected. "We've been struggling too. The divorce settlement hit her hard, and things haven't been easy for any of us." I leaned back in my chair, letting their words sink in. The irony was almost laughable. The same family that turned their backs on me during my darkest days now wanted my help. "What exactly are you asking for?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Financial support," Michael admitted. "Andrea is in a bad place, and the settlement wasn't enough to sustain her. We were hoping you could help, for Sophie's sake, if nothing else." Sophie. The mention of my stepdaughter's name tugged at something in me, but I quickly pushed it aside. Sophie made her choice when she sided with Andrea. Don't use her as a bargaining chip now. The room fell silent. Mom looked down at her hands, and Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I don't owe Andrea anything," I said firmly. "She made her choices, and so did you. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." "Adrian, please," Mom pleaded. "We're family. Can't we put the past behind us?" I stood up, my patience wearing thin. Family doesn't turn their backs on you when you're at your lowest. Family doesn't side with someone who destroyed your life. You want to talk about the past? Let's start there. Michael's face turned red with frustration. "You're being selfish," he snapped. "You're doing well now, and you can't even help us out? After everything Mom's done for you?" I laughed bitterly. "Everything Mom's done for me? Like taking Andrea's side? Like letting you all believe her lies while I struggled to put my life back together? Spare me the guilt trip, Michael." He opened his mouth to argue, but Mom placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Adrian, she said quietly, I'm sorry. We should have been there for you. But please, don't punish us for our mistakes. We just want to make things right. I looked at her, my heart softening for a moment, but then I remembered the sleepless nights, the loneliness, the way they all abandoned me when I needed them most. I've already made things right, I said. For myself. I don't need anything from you, and I'm not going to be a safety net for people who didn't care about me when it mattered. With that, I walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. That night, as I sat on my balcony, sipping a glass of whiskey, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a part of me that wanted to forgive them, to mend the fractured relationships, but a larger part of me knew that some bridges were better left burned. I had spent too long rebuilding my life to let anyone drag me back into the chaos. Andrea, Michael, my mother, they were part of a past that no longer defined me. As I stared out at the city lights, I felt a sense of peace. This was my life now, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. After walking out on my family's plea, I assumed the chapter was closed. But Michael had other plans. He texted me the next morning, if you're too proud to help, maybe you should hear what Andrea's been saying about you. Meet me at Mom's at 5. Curiosity got the better of me. If they thought guilt-tripping me with Andrea's words would work, they clearly hadn't realized how much I had changed. At 5 p.m., I pulled into Mom's driveway. The house looked the same as ever, familiar, yet alien. I stepped inside, greeted by the tense energy of a family ready for confrontation. Mom sat at the dining table, wringing her hands, while Michael leaned against the wall with an air of defiance. Glad you could make it, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Let's get this over with, I replied, taking a seat across from Mom. Michael wasted no time. Andrea's been telling people that you're heartless, that you abandoned her and Sophie. People are starting to believe her. I scoffed. People? Or just you? Michael's jaw tightened. It's not just me. Our neighbors, old friends, they're talking about how you've changed. You've got money now, but what does it matter if you've lost your soul? I leaned back in my chair, unfazed. Funny, when Andrea was draining my accounts and running off with her lover, I don't remember anyone questioning her soul. Or yours, for that matter. Mom jumped in, her voice pleading. Adrian, this isn't about taking sides. It's about doing what's right. Andrea made mistakes, but she's still struggling. And Sophie, she's innocent in all this. I stared at her, incredulous. You want to talk about doing what's right? Where was this concern when I was struggling? Where was this support when Andrea left me for dead, and you all stood by her? Michael crossed his arms. You're so caught up in your success now, you can't even see how selfish you've become. I laughed bitterly. Selfish? You think prioritizing my sanity and well-being makes me selfish? Let me tell you something, Michael. For years, I've been over backward for this family. I sacrificed everything to keep Andrea happy, to make this house a home. And what did I get in return? Betrayal. Abandonment. A family that couldn't even stand by me when I needed them most. The room fell silent. Mom looked down at her hands, and even Michael seemed at a loss for words. You call me selfish, I continued, my voice steady, but I call it self-respect. I'm done being the doormat, the scapegoat, the one who's expected to fix everything while everyone else gets a free pass. Andrea made her choices. So did you. And now, you can live with them. Michael, never one to back down, tried again. You think cutting us off makes you better than us? You're still bitter, Adrian. That's why you can't move on. I stood up, looking him square in the eye. You're wrong. I have moved on. That's why I'm not falling for this charade. You all want me to swoop in and save the day, to clean up the mess Andrea made. But I'm not that man anymore. Mom's voice wavered as she spoke. We just want to make things right. Isn't there any part of you that wants to forgive us? I softened slightly, my anger giving way to exhaustion. Forgiveness isn't about letting people back into your life, Mom. It's about letting go of the hurt. And I have. But letting go doesn't mean I owe you anything. Michael slammed his fist on the table. So that's it? You're just going to walk away? Yes, I said simply, because I deserve better than this. I turned and walked out of the house, feeling a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and, strangely, pride. For the first time in years, I had stood my ground, refusing to be manipulated or guilt-tripped. That night, as I sat on my balcony, the city lights twinkling below, I realized just how far I had come. The man I used to be, the one who sought validation from people who didn't respect him, was gone. In his place stood someone who understood his worth and wasn't afraid to demand better. A few weeks passed, and the dust from the confrontation with my family had started to settle. I was back to focusing on work and enjoying the newfound peace in my life. But peace, as I had learned, rarely lasted for long. One morning, as I was preparing for a meeting, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Adrian," came a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. It was Andrea. I froze for a moment, her voice triggering a flood of emotions: anger, resentment, and, most unexpectedly, indifference. I had moved past her betrayal, or so I thought, but hearing her again felt like reopening a wound I had worked so hard to heal. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. There was a pause on her end, and then she began speaking, her voice trembling. "I need your help," she said. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'm desperate." I leaned back in my chair, barely suppressing a bitter laugh. "Desperate? That's rich coming from you. What happened to your knight in shining armor?" Andrea hesitated before answering. "Greg left me," she admitted. "He drained my accounts and disappeared. I don't have anyone else to turn to." The irony of her situation wasn't lost on me. The man she had betrayed me for, the one she claimed was everything I wasn't, had abandoned her. Part of me wanted to revel in her misfortune, but another part, the part that still remembered the good years we shared, felt a pang of pity. "You're telling me this why?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a lot of mistakes, but I'm trying to fix things. I've been struggling to make ends meet, and Sophie, she's not doing well. I thought maybe you could help." Sophie. Hearing her name softened me, if only slightly. She was just a child, caught in the crossfire of adult decisions. But I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. "I'm sorry Sophie's struggling," I said carefully. "But that doesn't change what you did, Andrea. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Andrea started to cry, her voice cracking as she pleaded. "Adrian, please. I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for Sophie. She misses you. She asks about you all the time." Her words hit harder than I expected, but I didn't let it show. If Sophie wanted to stay in touch, she knew where to find me. "Don't use her to manipulate me, Andrea. I'm not the same man you left." There was a long silence on her end before she finally spoke again. "I understand," she said quietly. I didn't know where else to turn." "You've burned every bridge, Andrea," I replied. "That's not my fault." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling slightly. I wasn't angry, nor was I sad. If anything, I felt free. For the first time, I had faced Andrea and her manipulation head-on and emerged unscathed. That evening, as I reflected on the call, I realized how much I had grown. The old Adrian would have caved, letting guilt and obligation dictate his actions. But the man I was now understood the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Still, Sophie lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't ignore the part of me that cared for her, even if she had chosen her mother's side. But helping Andrea was out of the question. She had made her choices, and it was time for her to face the consequences. The next day, I received an email from Andrea. It was long and rambling, filled with apologies and justifications. She begged for one last chance, claiming she wanted to make amends for the sake of Sophie. I deleted it without replying. I knew this wasn't the end. Andrea wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when she thought she could gain something from me. But I also knew I was prepared for whatever came next. The unexpected twist wasn't Andrea's plea for help. It was the realization that I no longer needed her validation. Her words, her tears, even her guilt couldn't sway me anymore. I was free, and no one could take that away from me. As I sat on my balcony that night, the city lights twinkling below, I felt a sense of clarity. My journey wasn't over, but I was finally in control. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Months after Andrea's desperate plea, I found myself standing at a crossroads once again. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. My business was thriving. My social circle was full of supportive and genuine people, and the scars of my past had started to fade. But Andrea, ever persistent, decided to test my resolve one last time. It began with a letter from her lawyer, a demand for increased alimony. She claimed that her financial situation had worsened and that she required additional support to maintain a stable life for Sophie. The audacity of her request almost made me laugh. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, Sarah, who had been with me throughout the divorce. She reviewed it and called me immediately. "She's grasping at straws, Adrian," Sarah said. "She has no legal grounds to ask for more alimony. If anything, this could work in your favor." "How so?" I asked, intrigued. Sarah explained that if we could prove Andrea's mismanagement of her finances and her relationship with Greg, it would be easy to have the alimony reduced, or even eliminated entirely. The idea of not just rejecting Andrea's demands, but turning the tables was too tempting to resist. We started gathering evidence, revisiting everything from the divorce proceedings to Andrea's recent behavior. With Sarah's help, I obtained financial records that painted a clear picture of Andrea's spending habits, extravagant purchases, lavish trips with Greg, and zero regard for budgeting. But the piece de resistance was a series of emails between Andrea and Greg, detailing their plans to bleed me dry. Sarah's team had uncovered them during the initial divorce case, but we hadn't used them at the time. Now, they would be the cornerstone of my counterattack. The court date arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with a calm confidence I hadn't felt in years. Andrea was there, her once polished appearance now a shadow of what it had been. She looked nervous, her bravado from our last encounter completely gone. Her lawyer presented their case, painting her as a struggling single mother who needed more support to provide for Sophie. It was a compelling performance, but one that quickly unraveled when Sarah took the floor. Sarah's opening statement was surgical, dismantling Andrea's narrative piece by piece. She presented the financial records, the emails, and even testimonies from mutual acquaintances who confirmed Andrea's reckless spending and Greg's manipulative behavior. Andrea's lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. When it was Andrea's turn to speak, she stumbled through a series of excuses, blaming Greg, the economy, and even me for her situation. It was almost pitiful to watch, but I felt no sympathy. The judge reviewed the evidence and made a swift decision. Not only was Andrea's request for increased alimony denied, but the court also ruled to terminate the existing payments. The evidence of her financial misconduct and attempts to manipulate the system had sealed her fate. Andrea looked stunned as the judge delivered the verdict. She turned to me, her eyes pleading, but I didn't flinch. This was the closure I needed, the final nail in the coffin of our toxic relationship. After the hearing, Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse victorious. "You did it," she said, smiling. "No," I replied. "We did it. Thank you for everything." The weeks that followed were some of the most liberating of my life. I no longer had any financial ties to Andrea, and the weight of her betrayal was finally lifted. For the first time in years, I felt free. I focused on my business, expanding it further and investing in new ventures. My personal life flourished as well. I reconnected with old friends, traveled to places I had always dreamed of visiting, and even started dating again. One evening, as I stood on my balcony, watching the sunset over the city, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the struggles, it had all shaped me into the man I was today. Andrea's downfall wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming my life. And as I raised a glass to the horizon, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in winning the court case or cutting ties with her. It was in finding myself again, in rebuilding my life on my own terms. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I was free, and I was ready for whatever came next.